For centuries, the story of the Vikings in Scotland seemed straightforward. They came from Norway. They raided the coasts, burned monasteries, seized the islands, and replaced the people who had lived there before. It was a story of conquest, clean, dramatic, and apparently settled by the historical record. Ancient DNA is now telling us something different. Many of the so-called Vikings buried in Scotland weren't Scandinavian at all. And that single finding forces us to rethink almost everything we thought we understood about who the Vikings actually were. From the late 8th century onward, Norse longships appeared along the Scottish coast with increasing regularity. The Northern Isles, Orkney and Shetland, became powerful Norse strongholds. The Western Isles followed. The Hebrides fell under Norse control. Orkney became a Norse earldom. Old Norse place names spread across the landscape. Burial customs changed. The material culture became distinctly Scandinavian in character. To historians working from texts and artifacts alone, this looked like population replacement. The assumption followed a certain logic. If Viking culture had come to dominate, Viking blood must have dominated too. Conquerors reshape the places they conquer in their own image. That's how it works. But assumptions do not survive DNA. Over the last decade, ancient DNA technology has transformed what archaeology can tell us. Scientists can now extract genetic material from skeletons buried over 1,000 years ago and sequence it with remarkable precision, tracing ancestry and migration patterns in ways that were simply impossible before. Researchers began applying this technology to Viking Age burials across Britain, including graves in Scotland that were unmistakably Norse in character. These were not ambiguous cases. The graves contained swords, axes, oval brooches, and boat burials. Some individuals had been interred with full warrior honors. Everything about the burial context signaled Scandinavian identity. Culturally, these people looked Viking through and through. Genetically, many of them were not. When scientists examined the DNA from these Norse-style burials, the results were striking. Yes, some individuals showed clear Scandinavian ancestry, but many did not. Several high-status people buried with weapons and Viking artifacts carried overwhelmingly local British genetic profiles. In the simplest terms, they were culturally Viking but genetically Scottish. And this was not what the historical narrative had predicted. If the Vikings had truly replaced the indigenous population, the genetic record would show it. A dramatic shift away from local ancestry and towards Scandinavian lineages. Instead, what the DNA reveals is mixing, blending, integration. The Viking presence in Scotland did not erase the people who were already there. It merged with them. This forces a confrontation with one of the most powerful assumptions in how we think about the past. That Viking identity meant Scandinavian blood. Ancient DNA tells a more complex story. Being Viking, it turns out, was not purely a matter of ancestry. It was a matter of culture, political alignment, language, trade, and social identity. A man born in 9th century Orkney to Scottish parents could adopt Norse customs, speak Old Norse at the market, sail with Norse traders, live under Norse law, and fight in Norse conflicts. By every cultural measure, he would be Viking. And when he died, he might be buried exactly like a Scandinavian warrior, without ever having set foot in Norway. Viking, in other words, was not just an ethnicity, it was something you could become. Orkney provides one of the clearest examples. Ancient DNA from the islands shows significant Scandinavian ancestry during the Viking Age, but it is not total. There is clear continuity from the pre-Viking population. The genetic record does not show extermination. It shows mixture. And even today, modern Orcadians carry a measurable Norse genetic signal that exists alongside deep British ancestry predating the Viking Age entirely. The Vikings did not erase Scotland. They became part of it. This pattern, it turns out, is not unique to Scotland. Across Britain, ancient DNA is quietly rewriting the story of invasion after invasion. The Anglo-Saxons did not fully replace the Britons. The Normans did not wipe out the English. The Romans did not genetically transform the population they ruled. Time and again, What looks like conquest in the historical record turns out to be something messier and more human in the genetic record. Cultural dominance can happen without biological replacement. History remembers the dramatic invasions. Genetics reveals the quieter integrations. So why did we get it wrong for so long? Because for centuries, history was written through texts and artifacts. When archaeologists found Norse swords and Norse graves, they assumed Norse bodies. When linguists found Old Norse place names and Norse legal structures, they assumed a Norse population. But material culture spreads faster than genes. Political systems spread faster than ancestry. And identity can change within a single generation. Consider a young man born in northern Scotland around the year 900. He grows up under Norse rule, speaks Old Norse at the market, sails with Norse traders, fights in Norse conflicts. By every cultural measure, he is Viking. But genetically, he may carry mostly local Scottish ancestry. When he dies and is buried with a sword, future archaeologists will call him a Viking. And they will be right culturally, just not genetically. That distinction, it turns out, matters enormously. None of this destroys the story of the Vikings. It deepens it. Yes, Scandinavians came to Scotland. Yes, they raided and settled and established power. But they did not simply replace what they found. They intermarried. They integrated. They created something new. Over time, Norse and Scottish identities blended into a hybrid world. Not pure Scandinavia transplanted onto Scottish soil, but a genuine fusion of peoples who had become, over generations, something neither had been before. This also changes how we understand identity in the medieval world more broadly. We tend to imagine these societies as rigid and tribal, us versus them, native versus invader, blood-defining belonging. But the genetic evidence tells a more fluid story. Communities were porous. Power structures shifted. People adapted. Identity was not always written in blood. It was negotiated. There is something deeply human about that. The Vikings of Scotland were not simply foreign warriors imposing themselves on a passive land. They were settlers, neighbors, spouses, and parents of children born into mixed households. Over generations, the line between Norse and Scot blurred beyond recognition. What began as a rival became coexistence. What began as conquest became integration. Ancient DNA is transforming how we see the past, stripping away romantic myths of pure bloodlines and clean population replacements, revealing complexity where we once saw simplicity. The Vikings of Scotland were not just Scandinavian warriors carving out a foreign colony. They were part of a dynamic society where culture could spread beyond ancestry, where identity could be adopted, and where being Viking did not always mean being born in Norway. The truth was buried in their bones all along.